Daf Yomi, Tractate, Bava Batra, page 42, top of the page. 42a, top of the page, with the words Inhu, Asidran Shaihu. They caused their own loss by not investigating whether there was a lien on the property that they intended to buy. Umi Amar Rav Hachi, and we're asked, and did Rav in fact say this? That one can collect sold property by means of witnesses alone? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah in 175a that one who lends money to another with a promissory note collects his debt from lien property that has been sold after the loan, if the debtor has no other property? But if one lent by means of witnesses without a promissory note, he collects his debt only from the unsold property. V'chi tema Rav Tana hu palig. And if you would say that Rav is a Tana, and as such has the authority to dispute the determination of the Mishnah, but didn't Rav himself and Shmuel both say one who is owed a debt due to a loan by oral contract does not collect lien property, not from the heirs of the debtor, nor from the buyer, despite the fact that there are witnesses? This brings to mind the famous statement. Could be it's a famous statement, could be it's not so famous, but it's attributed to the famous movie mogul, studio executive Samuel Goldwyn, who said, "A verbal contract is not worth the paper it's written on." The Gemara answers, are you raising a contradiction from a case of a loan to a case of a sale? They are not comparable. In the case of a loan, when one borrows money, he borrows discreetly in order that his property not be devalued, as people will pay less for his property if they know that he is pressed for capital. Since a loan is issued discreetly, the presumption is that the buyers were unaware of the loan. Therefore, the creditor does not collect from sold property. By contrast, in the case of a sale, one who sells land sells it in public in order that publicity be generated with regard to it. Therefore, the cases of loans and sales are not comparable. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, if the father worked and profited from the land for 1 year, and the son who inherited it from him worked and profited from it for 2 years, or if the father worked and profited from the land for 2 years, and the son worked and profited for 1 year, or if the father worked and profited from the land for 1 year, and the son worked and profited from it also for 1 year, and the buyer who purchased it from the son worked and profited for 1 year, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Or asks, is that to say that with regard to a buyer, the transaction generates publicity, and one can raise a contradiction? We write into Sefta 2:8. If one worked and profited from the land in the presence of the father, the prior owner, for 1 year, and in the presence of the son, who then inherited it from the father, for 2 years, or in the presence of the father for 2 years, and in the presence of the son for 1 year, or in the presence of the father for 1 year, and in the presence of the son for 1 year, and in the presence of the buyer who purchased it from the son for 1 year, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And if it enters your mind that with regard to a buyer, the transaction generates publicity, there is no greater protest than this. By selling his land to someone else, the son of the prior owner is clearly stating that it does not belong to the possessor. Rav Papa said that is not a contradiction, as when that bride is taught. It is taught with regard to one who sells his fields without specification. The son of the prior owner sold his fields without clarifying which fields he was selling, since he did not specify the field from which the possessor is profiting. The possessor has no reason to assume that this field was being sold, and that he needed to hold on to his deed, and he establishes the presumption of ownership despite the sale. In case where the son and the prior owner stated explicitly that he was selling the field in question, the sale would serve as his protest. The Mishnah says, it's a new Mishnah, does it say, craftsmen who are in possession of items that they are pairing, and partners and sharecroppers and stewards do not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to property in their possession, as their possession is not indicative of ownership, since a man does not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to his wife's property, and a wife does not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to her husband's property, and a father similarly does not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to a son's property, and the son does not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to a father's property. A husband and wife, or son and father, each of whom acts others' property freely, possession is therefore not indicative of ownership. The Mishnah continues, in what cases is this statement? One that establishes the presumption of ownership after profiting from the property for a certain duration, with the exception of the above people said. It is said in a case of one who has more possession of the property which dies, in some cases, and serve as proof of ownership, but in case where another person gives one a gift, and there are brothers who divided their inheritance, or there is one who takes possession of the property of a convert who died without heirs, and his property is now ownerless. As soon as one locked the door of the property, or fenced it, or breached its fence even a little bit, this is considered taking possession of the property, and in effect acquisition.